The cuffs snapped shut, steel biting into Ethan Kane's wrists as the deputies sneered, dragging him into the fading light of a small Virginia town. To the crowd, he looked like a troublemaker. To the shop owner, just another drifter. But the truth they mocked and ignored was far heavier. Ethan was a Tomb Guard of Arlington, one of the chosen few who bore the sacred rhythm of 21 steps. And now, with the nation about to watch, a single mistake in this town would ignite a reckoning that stretched far beyond its borders. Follow my story to the end and comment the city you are watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The cuffs clicked, a sharp sound, too loud for such a small street. Cold steel bit into Ethan Kane's wrists. The pressure was immediate, the humiliation sharper still. The older deputy, his breath sour with tobacco, leaned close and sneered. "Turn around, soldier boy. You're under arrest." Ethan didn't argue, didn't jerk back, didn't beg. His boots stayed planted on the gravel, shoulders squared, eyes fixed straight ahead. His silence unsettled some in the crowd, but it gave the deputies confidence. They thought he was broken. He wasn't. Outside Mercer's souvenir shop, townsfolk lingered. They craned necks, whispered, some even chuckled. Tourists lifted phones to capture a man cuffed like a thief. To them, he was just another stranger passing through, another body for the sheriff's office to parade as trouble. But they were blind. They couldn't see the truth beneath the jeans and leather jacket, couldn't see the weight of service, couldn't see that this man had stood midnight watch at Arlington, that he had walked 21 steps, paused, 21 seconds repeating the rhythm of silence until it was carved into his bones. Ethan Kane wasn't just a man in cuffs. He was a tomb guard, one of the chosen few entrusted with guarding America's unknown soldiers. Inside the shop doorway, Frank Mercer leaned, arms crossed, lips curled in satisfaction. His voice carried out onto the street. "See, told you he was trouble. Flashing some fake ID pretending to be army. Lock him up already." The deputies didn't question, didn't pause to look at the federal ID still lying on the glass counter, its seal catching a flash of sunset light. They had what they wanted, another body to drag away. Ethan's chest lifted, once steady, controlled. His voice came even. "Officers, you're making a mistake." The younger deputy, all sharp jaw and cocky smirk, stepped closer. His voice dripped with contempt. "The only mistake is you thinking you can run your mouth." He shoved Ethan toward the door. The crowd shuffled back, murmurs rising. The street outside glowed in the last light of day. Old brick storefronts leaned against each other, their windows catching the orange sky. Flags hung limp above the post office. The town looked peaceful on the surface. But the cuffs clamped around Ethan's wrists told another story. A tourist couple stopped staring. An old man in a Vietnam veteran's cap pushed forward, leaning on his cane, his weathered face etched with disbelief. Among them stood Claire Donovan, 28, reporter for the Willow Ridge Gazette. She had only come by on a hunch, chasing a lead about small-town tempers. But instinct told her something larger was brewing. Her phone lifted in her hand, the red light blinking alive. She was streaming. Her voice shook at first, then steadied. "This is happening live in Willow Ridge, Virginia. A man claiming to be an active-duty soldier is being detained outside Mercer's souvenir shop. His military ID is on the counter, ignored." The younger deputy snapped, "Turn that off. Doesn't concern you." Claire didn't flinch. Her lens stayed locked on Ethan. Ethan standing cuffed, silent, unbowed. The veteran's voice rose rough but strong. "That man's no faker. I can see it in his stance. I served in Nam. I know a soldier when I see one," but the deputies didn't hear, or refused to. They dragged Ethan down the shop steps. Boots scraped, gravel shifted. Frank Mercer smirked from the doorway. His voice was sharp, cruel. "That's what happens when you think you're better than us?" Ethan turned his head, eyes finding Mercer's. His words came calm, steady, unshakable. "I don't think I'm better than anyone. I just do my duty. I honor the fallen." The words cut through the murmurs. A few townsfolk shifted, shame flickering across their faces. Some looked away. Then from inside the shop came the sound that froze the deputies. A buzz. Ethan's phone. Claire moved fast, snatching it up before Mercer's hand could close around it. The screen glowed bright. Her eyes widened. "Colonel Nathaniel Monroe." Her voice rang across the lot. "Officers, Colonel Monroe is calling. You need to answer this now." The older deputy faltered. The younger one's smirk broke. The crowd leaned forward, breath caught in the pause. And Ethan Kane, wrists raw from steel, lifted his chin at last. The reckoning was only beginning. The cuffs had been unlocked, but the memory of steel still burned across Ethan Kane's wrists. He could feel the ghost of that pressure even now, as though the metal had left its mark beneath the skin. For a soldier, pain was familiar. He had faced it on deserts where the heat could melt flesh in valleys, where gunfire tore silence apart on nights when the cries of his squad echoed until dawn. But humiliation in his own country, cut differently. It wasn't a bullet. It was betrayal. The town of Willow Ridge sprawled small, almost picturesque in the fading light. One stoplight, a handful of diners, storefronts with chipped paint leaning into each other like tired old men, a place where nothing ever changed, or so the locals believed. But tonight everything changed. Ethan's rental car sat parked beside Mercer's souvenir shop, its tires coated with gravel dust. The engine still ticked faintly, cooling after the drive from Arlington. He had come only for something simple, a gift for his mother's birthday. That was all. No ceremony, no uniform, no rifle at his shoulder, just jeans, a leather jacket, and a ball cap pulled low. Yet even dressed as a civilian, he carried himself with the weight of discipline. Shoulders square, eyes scanning without seeming to, movements deliberate, precise. The rhythm of 21 steps embedded in his muscles. Inside the shop, the bell above the door had jingled when he entered earlier. The air smelled stale, cheap plastic burnt coffee dust that had never been cleaned. Racks of postcards tilted flags faded to dull pink knockoff medals, glinting with false shine. Behind the counter, Frank Mercer had glared at him from the start. A wiry man, permanent scowl carved into his face, buzz cut turning gray at the edges. Suspicion radiated off him like heat. "Help you with something?" His voice had been a challenge, not a greeting. Ethan's answer had been calm. "Just looking for a gift. Something for my mom." Mercer's lip curled. "You don't look like the gift-buying type. What's your deal? You one of those wannabe soldier boys?" Ethan had kept his composure. "I serve." The smirk that followed was poison. "Serve, huh? Bet you're a weekend warrior, desk jockey. You don't look like you've seen a fight." In that moment, Ethan had wanted to tell him everything, the ambushes, the convoys, the friends buried far from home. But discipline had held him. "I'm a Tomb Guard. Arlington." Mercer's laugh had been sharp, ugly. "Don't make me laugh. Those guys are the real deal. You look like you're just playing dress-up." The words still echoed in Ethan's ears, though his silence had been steady. Then Claire Donovan had walked in, sharp-eyed, pretending to browse. Phone in her hand, camera rolling before anyone realized. Mercer had scoffed at Ethan's ID, tossing it onto the counter like trash. "Looks fake. Probably printed it at home," and Ethan, calm even then, had said, "That's a federal ID. Take another look." But Mercer hadn't. Instead, he had called the sheriff's office, whispering lies into the receiver. Within minutes, Doyle and Briggs had stormed in, suspicion already burning in their eyes. They hadn't listened, hadn't checked, hadn't cared, and the cuffs had snapped shut. Now outside, the crowd buzzed. Some whispered uneasily. Some pulled out phones. The old veteran had spoken up, his voice trembling but strong. "Let him go. He's one of ours." But the deputies had ignored him. They thought they had control. Until Ethan's phone buzzed on the counter. Claire had seen it, had grabbed it before Mercer could. Her voice had rung sharp across the lot. "Colonel Nathaniel Monroe is calling. Answer this now." The deputy's confidence had faltered. The crowd leaned forward, and Doyle, hand tight on the phone, had barked into the speaker. "Yeah, who's this?" The reply was thunder. "This is Colonel Nathaniel Monroe, Arlington National Cemetery. You are detaining Staff Sergeant Ethan Kane, Tomb Guard, under my command. Release him immediately." The crowd gasped. Claire's stream caught every second. Doyle's face paled. Briggs's smirk vanished. Mercer's bravado shrank to dust. Ethan hadn't moved. He hadn't needed to. His silence had spoken louder than their noise. Now as the evening deepened, red and blue lights still flashed across the shop windows, though the deputies stood frozen. The old veteran leaned heavier on his cane, tears bright in his eyes. Claire whispered into her phone for the live stream. The truth is out. Colonel Monroe himself has spoken. Justice is coming to Willow Ridge. And Ethan Kane, wrists raw, eyes steady, lifted his chin. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The crowd outside Mercer's souvenir shop had thickened like moths drawn to a flame. What had begun as a handful of curious onlookers was now dozens, locals, tourists, veterans, children clutching their parents' hands. Phones glowed in every direction, capturing the spectacle. A man in jeans and a ball cap, wrists red from steel, accused of being an imposter. But now the tide was shifting. The name on Ethan Kane's buzzing phone, Colonel Nathaniel Monroe, hung in the air like thunderclouds. Everyone had heard Claire Donovan's sharp cry, "Colonel Monroe is calling." "Answer this now," Sergeant Doyle, face pale under the flashing lights, held the phone like it might explode. His voice faltered as he lifted it. Hello?" The reply was not a hello. "This is Colonel Nathaniel Monroe. You are detaining Staff Sergeant Ethan Kane, Tomb Guard, Arlington National Cemetery, under my command. Release him immediately." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The old veteran's cane struck the pavement, his salute trembling but firm. "Told you he's one of ours." Deputy Briggs's smirk crumbled. He glanced around nervously, sweat beading at his temple. "Colonel, sir, we didn't know. He wasn't in uniform." "You had his ID in your hand," Monroe thundered. "You chose not to check. That choice has consequences." The live stream audience swelled past tens of thousands. Comments streamed faster than Claire could read. "Outrageous, free the guard." "Respect our soldiers." The cuffs clicked open at last. Briggs fumbled with the key, his fingers trembling. Ethan rubbed his wrist slowly, calmly, though the skin was raw. His voice, steady as stone, cut through the hush. "Colonel, I am secure." "Awaiting orders. Stay where you are," Sergeant Monroe commanded. "We are coming." The line went dead, but the weight of those words lingered. Silence fell over the deputies. Doyle's jaw worked, but no sound came. Mercer shifted in his doorway, face draining of smugness. He tried to speak. "I was just protecting my shop, that's all." But his voice withered under the weight of the crowd's glares. Claire's voice rose clear and unwavering, narrating for her stream. "You are witnessing history. Staff Sergeant Ethan Kane, Tomb Guard, wrongfully detained in Willow Ridge. Colonel Monroe himself has intervened. Federal eyes are now on this town." The murmurs built into chants. "Justice, justice, justice." Ethan stood silent in the middle of it, taller somehow, despite the bruises on his wrists. He didn't gloat. He didn't speak. He simply looked out at the crowd with the same composure he carried at the tomb. Then came the sound that changed everything. Engines. Heavy, coordinated, unmistakable. The roar grew louder until 3 black SUVs screeched into the lot tires, spitting gravel. Doors swung open in perfect unison. Military police stepped out, boots striking pavement like hammers. Their presence was immediate, undeniable. From the lead vehicle, Colonel Nathaniel Monroe emerged. 55 chest decorated with medals, uniform sharp as a blade. His eyes blazed as they swept across Doyle, Briggs, Mercer, and finally landed on Ethan. "Sergeant Kane." His voice boomed, filling the lot. "Are you harmed?" Ethan straightened instinctively. "No, sir. Just a misunderstanding." Monroe turned his face hard as granite toward the deputies. "This incident is now federal. You are ordered to stand down. Any further action will be considered obstruction of justice." The crowd erupted in cheers. Veterans saluted. Children waved flags. Phones caught every angle. Doyle stammered, We didn't know." "You chose ignorance," Monroe cut in. "And you will answer for it." Mercer tried again, his voice breaking. "I was just enough," Monroe thundered. "You judged him by what you thought he was not what he is, and that choice will cost you." The military police formed a protective circle around Ethan, guiding him toward the SUVs. The crowd parted, many saluting as he passed. Claire followed close, streaming every second, her voice shaking with adrenaline. "This is Staff Sergeant Ethan Kane, escorted by Colonel Monroe and military police. What began as humiliation has become a reckoning. As the SUVs pulled away, Ethan glanced back once. Mercer stood small in his doorway, bravado gone. Doyle and Briggs slumped beside the cruiser, shame etched across their faces. The old veteran raised his trembling hand in salute one more time. Ethan returned it crisp and precise before disappearing into the convoy. And the town of Willow Ridge would never be the same. The convoy rolled out of Willow Ridge with precision, 3 black SUVs cutting through the night. Engines hummed like a drumbeat of authority, their headlights slicing the darkness. Inside the lead vehicle, Ethan Kane sat in silence, his wrists sore, his jaw tight. The smell of leather seats mixed with the faint scent of gun oil from the MP's weapons. Across from him, Colonel Nathaniel Monroe sat rigid, his cap tucked under his arm. His gaze stayed fixed on Ethan, a mixture of fury and pride burning in his eyes. Beside Ethan, Claire Donovan still held her phone, though she had stopped streaming. Her hands trembled slightly, the adrenaline finally wearing off. For a long stretch of road, no one spoke. Only the hum of tires and the faint crackle of radios filled the silence. Then Monroe broke it. His voice was low-controlled but carried the weight of command. "Sergeant, you conducted yourself with discipline. You kept your composure when others sought to strip you of it. That is the measure of a soldier." Ethan's reply was steady, almost too calm. "I didn't do it for them, sir. I did it for the fallen. The silence belongs to them." Claire turned, studying him. Her reporter's instincts urged her to press, but she hesitated. She saw in Ethan's face something unyielding, something carved deeper than words. Monroe leaned forward. "The nation has already seen what happened tonight. By morning, it will be everywhere. Willow Ridge thought this was a small-town mistake. They have no idea what storm is coming." Ethan's eyes flickered to the window. Outside the field stretched dark fences glinting silver under the moon. "What will happen to the deputies, sir?" To Mercer, Monroe's jaw tightened. "They'll answer to the Department of Justice, administrative leave investigations charges. The sheriff's department will face scrutiny it cannot outrun." Claire's pen scratched in her notebook. "And the town? What happens to Willow Ridge?" "Now." Monroe's gaze shifted to her. "That depends on how they choose to remember tonight, as a moment of shame or as a lesson." The convoy slowed as they neared Arlington. The gates loomed tall marble white, even under moonlight, the silence beyond them deeper than any night road. To Ethan, it was home, sacred ground. As the SUVs rolled to a stop, MPs stepped out first, their boots striking pavement in crisp rhythm. Monroe gestured for Ethan to follow. Claire climbed out too, her coat pulled tight against the cool air. The cemetery spread wide, thousands of headstones glowing pale beneath the stars. Ethan's chest tightened at the sight. No matter how many times he returned, it humbled him, rows upon rows of names, and the tomb's silent, eternal waiting. Monroe placed a hand on his shoulder. "Remember this, Sergeant. Tonight they judged you for what they thought you were. Tomorrow you show them who you are." Ethan knotted his throat tight. "Yes, sir." Claire lifted her phone again, hesitant. "Do you want me to keep recording?" Ethan's eyes stayed on the tomb. His voice came steady. "Record. Not for me. For them." The red light blinked on. Ethan walked slowly toward the ceremonial grounds, his shadow stretching long across marble. Each step echoed. Deliberate, precise, sacred. Claire whispered into the mic, her voice trembling with awe. "This is Staff Sergeant Ethan Kane, returning to his post at Arlington after humiliation in Willow Ridge." The world is watching now. The MPs formed a perimeter. Monroe stood tall, his silhouette proud against the white stone. And Ethan began again. 21 steps. Pause. 21 seconds. Pause. He wasn't walking for the cameras, not for the crowd, not even for the storm waiting beyond Arlington's gates. He walked for the unknown. And in that silence, the reckoning grew. Dawn broke over Virginia with a pale light washing the marble stones of Arlington in silver. The air was cool, the grass damp with dew, and the silence of the cemetery hung heavy as always. But outside the gates, silence had vanished. Reporters crowded the entrance cameras perched on shoulders, lenses gleaming like rows of black eyes. Satellite trucks hummed chords snaked across sidewalks. Willow Ridge was no longer just a town, it had become a headline. and now Arlington was the epicenter. Claire Donovan stood among the throng, notebook open, recorder ready. Her eyes searched past the crowd, waiting for the soldier whose silence had lit a fire across the nation. Inside the barracks, Ethan Kane sat at a small wooden desk. His dress blues hung pressed and immaculate, waiting on the hanger beside him. His gloves were already pulled tight, his shoes polished until they caught the morning light. He stared at his hands, wrists still faintly marked from the cuffs. The redness was fading, but the memory remained sharp. Colonel Nathaniel Monroe entered the morning paper tucked under his arm. He dropped it onto the desk without a word. The headline screamed in bold letters, "Tomb Guard cuffed in Virginia, nation outraged." Ethan's eyes skimmed the page but did not linger. "I didn't ask for this, sir." Monroe's voice was firm but not unkind. "None of us ask for the battles we're given, Sergeant. We just fight them with the weapons we have. And last night, your weapon was silence." Ethan looked away, his jaw tight. "I wasn't silent for them. I was silent because the fallen deserve it." Monroe studied him for a long moment. Then he placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "And that's why the nation is listening." The colonel stepped aside, gesturing. "They want you to speak. The governor, the press, veterans groups. You've become the face of something bigger than Willow Ridge." Ethan rose slowly, the weight of his uniform heavy even before he put it on. "If I speak, it won't be for me." Monroe nodded. "That's why it has to be you." Minutes later, Ethan emerged into the morning air. His uniform was sharp, every crease perfect, shoes gleaming. The crowd outside the gates hushed. Flags waved softly, hands lifted in salute. Reporters surged forward, microphones raised. Staff Sergeant Kane. "Do you believe you were profiled?" "Sergeant, what do you want to say to the deputies who cuffed you? Are you going to press charges?" Ethan did not answer. He stepped past them, shoulders square, eyes fixed on the tomb. Claire followed at the edge, her recorder trembling in her hand. At the podium just beyond the gates, Monroe gestured. "The nation is watching, Sergeant." Ethan took his place. Cameras clicked like gunfire. The crowd leaned forward. He let the silence stretch heavy, deliberate, until even the reporters held their breath. Then he spoke. "I did not stand silent because I had nothing to say. I stood silent because silence is what I carry every day." His voice was calm, but it reached the edges of the crowd. "At Arlington, we march 21 steps. We pause 21 seconds. We guard those who gave everything yet have no names. In that silence, we honor them." The audience stilled. Even the reporters seemed frozen. "Last night I was judged not by my service, but by what someone thought I was. I was cuffed, dismissed, disrespected. But hear me clearly, respect is not negotiable. Honor cannot be stripped by arrogance. And silence cannot be broken by steel." The crowd erupted. Veterans saluted. Families cheered. Flags rippled in the breeze. Claire's recorder captured it all, her throat tight with emotion. Ethan stepped back, his eyes steady, his posture unbroken. He hadn't spoken for applause. He hadn't spoken for sympathy. He had spoken because truth, like silence, was unshakable. Monroe's voice rang beside him. "This is just the beginning. Willow Ridge will face its reckoning." And Ethan Kane. Tomb Guard returned once more to his post. 21 steps. Pause. 21 seconds. Pause. The nation now walked with him. The sun had climbed higher over Virginia, washing Arlington in gold. Crowds still pressed against the gates, their numbers growing with each passing hour. Veterans stood in rows, shoulders squared despite their age, some leaning on canes, others in wheelchairs. Families waved flags. Children clutched handmade signs. Honor the guard. Respect the sentinel. Inside the grounds, Ethan Kane walked his post. His cadence was exact. 21 steps, 21 seconds. The sound of his boots echoed across marble like a heartbeat. To the world outside, he was the symbol of defiance. To Ethan, he was simply fulfilling the vow he had sworn long before Willow Ridge. But even as he marched, he felt the weight of eyes that had never been there before. Phones rose high beyond the ropes. Reporters scribbled. Claire Donovan stood among them, her recorder clutched tight, her pen flying across paper. She whispered into her mic. "Every step he takes is history." When his shift ended, Ethan stepped back into the barracks. He removed his gloves slowly, carefully, as though each crease mattered. His hands trembled faintly, not from fear, but from the toll of carrying silence before the gaze of a nation. Colonel Nathaniel Monroe entered a thick folder under his arm. His expression was carved from stone. Sergeant, the Department of Justice has filed a formal inquiry. Doyle, Briggs, Mercer, even Sheriff Dalton, they're under investigation. Ethan sat heavily on the bench, staring at the faint red marks on his wrists. So soon, Monroe nodded. Your live stream forced their hand. Claire's video has gone viral. Willow Ridge isn't just a town anymore. It's a symbol. And symbols don't fade quietly. Claire stepped into the room, notebook, open, her eyes searching Ethan's face. Do you want to make a statement? The nation's waiting to hear more from you. Ethan shook his head. I've already spoken. Words aren't what matters now. Silence is. Claire's pen stilled. She studied him, the lines in his face, the steadiness in his gaze. She realized then that this wasn't about headlines for him. It wasn't even about justice. It was about honor that could not be bent by humiliation, not even by chains of steel. That evening, Monroe summoned Ethan again. The governor had requested his presence at a press conference in Richmond. The SUVs waited outside, engines idling. As they drove, Ethan stared out the window. The fields blurred past the fences and barns and quiet towns. He remembered his mother's smile, the gift he had never managed to buy. He thought of the ambush in Afghanistan, the dust, the blood, the silence after the explosion. He thought of carrying brothers home. The cuffs in Willow Ridge had hurt, but they hadn't broken him. Nothing could. In Richmond, the press swarmed, cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward. The governor stood at the podium, his voice sharp. What happened in Willow Ridge is unacceptable. We honor those who guard the fallen. We demand accountability. Then he gestured to Ethan. And today we stand with Staff Sergeant Ethan Kane. The cameras turned. The questions flew. Sergeant, do you forgive the deputies? Do you believe this was prejudice? Are you planning legal action? Ethan stepped to the microphone. His voice was low but firm. I didn't stand silent last night because I was powerless. I stood silent because I carry silence every day at Arlington. Silence is not weakness. Silence is strength. The crowd hushed, the words echoing. I was cuffed, humiliated. But understand, this respect is not optional. Honor cannot be stripped by arrogance, and silence when held with dignity is unbreakable. The applause surged, shaking the chamber. Veterans rose to their feet, saluting. Families cheered. Claire's recorder caught it all, her throat tight with emotion. Later, back at Arlington, Ethan returned to his post. Boots struck marble. Rifles gleamed. The rhythm of 21 steps began again. Outside the gates, the crowd still watched. But Ethan didn't march for them. He never had. He marched for the fallen. And in that silence, the reckoning spread like wildfire. By the next morning, Willow Ridge was no longer just a small town tucked among Virginia's hills. It was the center of a storm. Satellite trucks lined its streets. Reporters jostled for space outside the sheriff's office. Protesters gathered with flags and banners. The once quiet sidewalks now thundered with chants. Respect the guard. Justice for Ethan. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder, caps, low medals pinned to faded jackets. Some leaned on canes, others rolled forward in wheelchairs, their voices carried with a strength that no age could silence. Inside his cramped office, Sheriff Dalton sat hunched behind his desk. His tie loosened his eyes, bloodshot. Sweat clung to his forehead. He had faced reporters before, but never like this. Every question was a blade. Sheriff, why did your deputies dismiss a federal military ID? Sheriff, are Doyle and Briggs still employed? Sheriff, do you accept responsibility? Dalton's voice cracked. We regret the incident. The deputies involved are on administrative leave. A full investigation is underway. His words were swallowed by jeers. No one believed him. His town no longer trusted him. The eyes of the nation would not allow it. Doyle and Briggs remained hidden, holed up in their homes. The walls could not block the sound of protesters chanting their names with fury. Old complaints resurfaced, online claims of heavy-handed stops arrogance on duty reports once buried, now unearthed. and Frank Mercer's souvenir shop stood boarded up. Spray painted across the plywood were the words, "Coward, respect soldiers." His business was gone, his name ash. Neighbors passed by without speaking. His smirk was nowhere to be found. Meanwhile, at Arlington, Ethan Kane stood once more in silence. His boot struck marble, steady as a drumbeat. 21 steps, 21 seconds, the rhythm unbroken. Tourists gathered in hushed awe. Veterans saluted, tears glistening in their eyes. Claire Donovan stood among them, her pen idle for once, her phone lowered. She simply watched. She had written pages about him already, but none of it could capture this, the silence, the steadiness, the way dignity radiated from him with every step. That evening, Ethan sat in the barracks uniform, folded gloves resting on the desk. Claire sat across from him, recorder off. Her voice was quiet, searching. "Why didn't you fight back?" she asked. Ethan rubbed his wrist, the faint red mark still there. His eyes stayed steady. Because fighting back would have proved them right. They wanted anger. They expected defiance. I gave them silence. Claire's pen scratched fast. But she paused, looking up. And what do you want people to take from that silence? He looked at her, his expression unreadable. That respect isn't optional. That honor isn't negotiable. That silence can speak louder than any shout. She swallowed hard, her hand trembling slightly. For the first time, she realized she wasn't just writing about a soldier. She was writing about a man who had become a mirror for the nation's conscience. Later that night, the news spread further. Networks replayed clips of Ethan's calm testimony, his words at the podium. Civil rights leaders called it a turning point. Veterans groups demanded accountability. The president's press secretary released a statement. The treatment of Staff Sergeant Ethan Kane raises serious concerns about respect for those who serve. At Arlington, Ethan prepared for another shift. He slid on his gloves, adjusted his cap, picked up his rifle. Colonel Monroe stopped him at the door. His voice was firm, his eyes steady. "Sergeant, you've become the face of something greater. But remember this, the tomb is not about politics. It is about the fallen. Never forget where your duty lies." Ethan nodded. "Yes, sir. My duty is here." Then he stepped out into the night. The crowd hushed. His boots struck marble. The rhythm began again. 21 steps. Pause. 21 seconds. Pause. The world might roar outside. But inside the silence of Arlington, Ethan Kane remained unbroken. The storm around Willow Ridge did not fade, it grew. By dawn the next day, the sleepy town was drowned in the hum of satellite trucks, the glare of floodlights, the crush of reporters angling for sound bites. Willow Ridge, once forgotten on a map, was now the name on every tongue. Claire Donovan's live stream from the night before had passed 1 million views before sunrise. News anchors replayed it endlessly. Ethan Kane standing calm in cuffs, the deputies sneering, the old veterans saluting, and Colonel Monroe's thunderous voice commanding his release. It was no longer just a clip, it was a symbol. Inside Arlington, however, silence reigned. Ethan sat at a wooden table, his gloves laid neatly beside him, his shoes polished to perfection. A mug of coffee cooled in his hands. He hadn't touched it. His eyes stared at nothing, thoughts circling like vultures. Across from him, Claire sat with her notebook open. She had asked for this meeting not as a reporter chasing headlines, but as someone who wanted to understand. "You didn't flinch," she said softly. "Not when they mocked you, not when they cuffed you. Most men would have fought back." Ethan's gaze lifted slowly. His voice was steady. Fighting back would have proved them right. They wanted to see defiance. I gave them silence. Claire leaned forward, her pen hovering. "Do you know what people are calling you, the living sentinel? You stood like stone." The title made Ethan's chest tighten. He shook his head. "I'm not a symbol. I'm a soldier. My duty isn't about me." Claire's pen scratched, but her eyes lingered on him. "Maybe not to you, but to them." "You already are." The door opened. Colonel Nathaniel Monroe entered, crisp as always, his presence filling the room. He carried the weight of command, but also the weight of anger. "Sergeant Kane," he said firmly. "You're needed. Now." Ethan rose without hesitation. Claire followed. Outside, the press swarmed. At the courthouse in Willow Ridge, Sheriff Dalton faced the cameras, Doyle and Briggs flanking him, their faces pale and drawn. Dalton's voice wavered as microphones thrust toward him. The department regrets the incident. Protocol wasn't followed. The deputies are suspended pending investigation, reporters shouted over each other. Sheriff, why was federal ID dismissed? Sheriff, was race a factor? Deputies, do you have anything to say to Sergeant Kane? Doyle stayed stone-faced, his jaw clenched. Briggs shifted nervously, sweat running down his neck. Neither spoke. From the crowd, the old veteran's voice rang out, shaky but fierce. Apologize to that soldier. Apologize right now. The chant began low at first, then louder. Apologize, apologize. Dalton tugged at his collar, stammering, but the chant drowned him out. The world had seen the truth already. No excuse could bury it now. Ethan stood silently at the edge, surrounded by military police. His eyes fixed on Doyle, on the man who had twisted his arm. For a moment their gazes locked. Doyle looked away first. Engines roared in the distance. Black SUVs again. The crowd parted as they rolled in. Military police stepped out, boots striking pavement in unison. Monroe's voice cut across the noise like a blade. Enough. This matter is now federal. These men will face accountability. Willow Ridge will answer for what it allowed. Cheers erupted. Flags waved. Veterans saluted. The chant shifted, no longer demanding apology, but roaring with support. Justice Claire raised her phone high, her voice firm. This is Staff Sergeant Ethan Kane, Tomb Guard of Arlington. What began as humiliation has become a reckoning. The nation is watching. Ethan exhaled slowly. His duty remained unchanged, 21 steps, 21 seconds. But now each step carried the weight of millions. The courthouse steps in Willow Ridge trembled under the weight of bodies and voices, not from an earthquake, from a reckoning. Flags snapped, banners lifted, microphones raised like spears. The chant rolled up the stone facade, bounced off the columns, and spilled back onto Main Street. Justice, 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 Ethan Kane watched from the open door of the black SUV at the edge of the square. The tinted glass threw his reflection back. Jaw set, eyes steady. Faint red bands still circling his wrists like ghosts of steel. He felt none of the triumph the crowd wanted for him. He felt the heaviness instead. The responsibility. Claire Donovan stood on the curb, one foot in the gutter, one on the sidewalk, phone held high. The live stream counter sprinted upward, a blur of numbers. Comments poured in faster than she could read. The silent sentinel, America's guard. We see you. She swallowed, then spoke for the world. We're live in Willow Ridge. Staff Sergeant Ethan Kane is here. The governor wants a statement. Colonel Monroe is on site. The town is altered. The driver looked back. We've got a lane to the steps, Sergeant. Colonel says we move on his signal. Ethan's fingers flexed once. He glanced at the courthouse doors, dark wood brass handles polished by 100 small-town trials. He thought of other doors, plywood blown from hinges, a school doorway in Logar Province, where he had carried a child through dust that tasted like coins. The flare of memory faded. Monroe appeared at the window, cap tucked beneath his arm. Eyes hot. Sergeant, he said, voice flat with purpose, you don't owe them a speech. But if you choose to speak, make it true. Keep it yours. Yes, sir. And remember, softer, you carry more than yourself up those steps. The door opened fully. Sound rushed in, chants, sirens, a church bell ringing off schedule. MPs fanned forward, creating a path. Claire fell in behind them, narrator and witness both. They moved. Up close, the crowd was a tide. Faces blurred into a single moving thing, angry, hopeful, ashamed, proud. Veterans saluted. Mothers lifted children. Teenagers' faces lit by phones shouted Ethan's name like a promise they had just learned to make. On the second step, a man in a faded navy jacket reached out, then stopped, fingers shaking. Ethan paused, met his eyes. The man whispered, "For my brother." Ethan nodded, then climbed again. At the top, a plywood platform, 2 flags, 1 seal, a clutter of microphones bristling like quills. The governor waited, speech in hand, already behind the moment. Monroe stepped to the mics first. This is a federal matter. It will be handled as such. He didn't look at Doyle and Briggs, small and stiff, by the door. He didn't have to. Then Monroe gestured. Ethan walked forward. Clicks of cameras in a staccato rhythm. The square drew a breath and held it. He didn't speak. Not yet. Silence gathered around him thick as midnight inside the tomb. He let it settle. Let the chant die of its own noise. When he lifted his head, the microphone seemed to lean in. I stood silent, he said, voice low, unhurried. Not because I was afraid. Not because I had nothing to say. I stood silent because I carry silence every day. A ripple. Then stillness. At Arlington, we walked 21 steps. We paused 21 seconds. Sun. Snow. Rain that turns gloves to stone. We keep that watch for men whose names were taken by war, for families who never got to say goodbye. He glanced toward an old veteran gripping his cane like a staff. That silence belongs to them. I don't break it lightly. He looked at his wrists at the rings of raw skin. Last night I was judged by what someone thought I was, not by what I have done. Cuffs can close around your hands. They cannot close around honor. A low sound, half sob, half cheer moved through the crowd. I don't want revenge, he said. I don't need apologies on television. A beat. I want something simpler. I want respect to stop being a choice. I want the men and women who wear the uniform and the ones who never took it off because they're buried beneath it to be met first with dignity, not suspicion. He shifted. The platform creaked. If we cannot respect the living, how dare we claim to honor the dead weather? It hit like weather. You didn't argue. You adjusted. The governor's prepared remarks sagged. Claire's screen filled with comments too fast to read. She wiped her cheek with the back of her wrist and didn't notice. Ethan let silence return for 3 breaths. 1, 2, 3, then stepped back. He didn't raise a fist, didn't smile. He simply turned. A reporter called Sergeant Kane. Were you profiled? Do you forgive them? He paused, looked over his shoulder. I'll let the evidence answer the first, he said. As for the second, some things don't belong to me to forgive. Another voice urgent. What do you say to kids who feel invisible? He faced them a fraction. You are not what small minds decide you are. Stand how you want to be remembered. He descended 1 step. A boy shouted high and breaking. Thank you, sir. Ethan stopped, found the freckled face, gave a precise nod. The boy lit like a match. On the landing, Monroe leaned close. You did what you came to do. I didn't come to do, Ethan said. I came to stand. They moved back through the sea of people. Claire narrated between breaths. He spoke for 3 minutes, maybe 4, but the silence around those minutes. God, you can feel it, even here. A sign shoved toward her lens. Respect isn't optional. Filled the frame, the cardboard trembling. Halfway to the SUV, the old veteran from the night before stepped out. Smaller in daylight maybe, or grief had made him larger at night. He planted his cane, raised his other hand in salute. Fingers shook. The line was arrow straight. Ethan stopped. Returned the salute sharp, exact, sacred. For the ones we couldn't bring home, the veteran whispered. For them, Ethan said. Doors opened, engines hummed. Claire slid in last. You just gave them a North Star, she said. The star's always been there, Ethan answered. Maybe we cleared the clouds. The convoy pulled away. The square changed its sound chants, softening into talks, into arguments pressed low and tight, as if people didn't trust their own volume anymore. On the steps, the governor folded his papers and promised the word the crowd would not release accountability. Inside a narrow hallway funneled Doyle and Briggs toward a room with a table and 2 chairs and a federal seal. The door closed with a sound that wasn't loud but felt final. Frank Mercer stuck to the pillar's shadow. A reporter asked, anything to say to Staff Sergeant Kane? He opened his mouth, closed it, stared at his hands. The SUVs gained speed. The town slid back first, the courthouse, then the square, then the awning where a banner flapped like a flag that couldn't decide what the wind meant. Claire lowered her phone. They're calling this the beginning. It isn't, Ethan said. There were 1,000 moments before this. We just didn't point a camera at them. Monroe smiled without showing teeth. Pointed at you today, Sergeant. You held. Fence lines unspooled. Fields opened. The tomb drew near, a horizon you could reach with your feet, never with anything less than your soul. Ethan let the noise fall away. Let the rhythm rise. 21 steps, pause. 21 seconds, pause. He counted them in his head while the car carried him home. Back at Arlington, people would gather behind the rope. Some would whisper his name. Some would simply listen. The marble would not care either way. It would hold what it always held, the weight of honor, the hush of the unknown, the echo of a guard's measured walk. The convoy crested a low hill. The city's pale edge came into view. Almost there, Claire whispered. Ethan nodded. Almost there. Always there. Ready to stand again. Night pressed down on Willow Ridge like a heavy hand. The courthouse square, once alive with chants, had emptied into uneasy quiet. Floodlights still glared against stone columns. Cables snaked across sidewalks where reporters huddled in makeshift camps, their voices hushed but restless, waiting for the next headline to break. Inside the sheriff's office, the air smelled of sweat, stale coffee, and fear. Sheriff Dalton sat slumped in his chair, his tie loosened, his face pale. His deputies, Doyle and Briggs, sat stiff across from him, stripped of their badges, waiting like condemned men. "You brought hell to my doorstep," Dalton spat, his fist slamming the desk. "Do you realize what you've done? The DOJ is in town. The governor's office won't stop calling. And the colonel, he wants you both nailed to the wall." Briggs stammered. "Sheriff, we didn't know. He wasn't in uniform. You didn't know." Dalton roared, his voice breaking. "You had his ID in your hands. You threw it away. You cuffed a tomb guard. Do you know what that means? The nation's ready to crucify us?" Doyle didn't answer. He stared down at his hands, jaw clenched, the image of Ethan Kane's calm eyes carved into his mind. He remembered the feel of the cuffs locking. He remembered the silence. That silence burned louder than any protest chant. Dalton paced, running a trembling hand through thinning hair. "Suspension isn't enough. We're staring at charges: false arrest, obstruction, abuse of authority. They want blood." The room fell quiet. The only sound was the low hum of fluorescent lights and the distant rumble of generators outside. Meanwhile, miles away, Ethan Kane stood once again on the marble at Arlington. The night air was cool, the silence deep. His boots struck in rhythm, 21 steps, pause, 21 seconds, pause. To the crowd gathered beyond the ropes, it was a ceremony. To Ethan, it was life, the rhythm of honor, the rhythm of silence. Yet even as he walked, memories clawed at him. Mercer's sneer, Doyle's hand twisting his arm, the smirk on Briggs's face, and the old veteran trembling but proud, raising his hand in salute. Those images burned into his thoughts, blending with the ghosts of far darker nights, the desert ambushes, the screams in dust-choked valleys, the silence of brothers he had carried home. In the shadows, Colonel Monroe watched, his chest swelling with both pride and fury. He had seen soldiers break under fire, but Ethan's stillness was something else, unyielding, unbreakable. Claire Donovan stood nearby, phone, lowered eyes locked on Ethan. For once, she didn't write. She simply witnessed. Back in Willow Ridge, Frank Mercer sat in darkness, his shop boarded, his name smeared across headlines. Spray paint scarred the boards, coward, shame. His phone buzzed with threats and lawsuits, his reputation reduced to ash. He muttered to himself, rocking slightly on a stool. "Didn't mean no harm, just protecting my shop. Just didn't trust him." But the words rang hollow. Ethan's calm gaze haunted him, exposing his smallness. By morning, news anchors debated the meaning of Willow Ridge. Civil rights leaders called for reform. Veterans demanded apologies. Even the president's press secretary spoke. The treatment of Staff Sergeant Ethan Kane raises serious concerns about respect for service members and the integrity of law enforcement. At Arlington's gates, the press swarmed, waiting. Ethan emerged in full uniform, rifle gleaming at his shoulder. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Each step was enough. Claire whispered into her recorder, her voice hushed. "He hasn't said a word since last night, and yet every movement speaks volumes. Across the country, millions watched. Silence had become protest. Silence had become power. And as Ethan marched 21 steps, 21 seconds, the nation marched with him. The night bled into morning, and the story did not sleep. Cameras did not blink. Reporters did not rest. Satellite dishes turned toward a pale sky hungry for signal. Arlington, wrapped in stone, wore a new quiet, watchful, measured, the kind that forms before a verdict. Ethan Kane walked his post, boot, marble, breath, pause, 21 steps forward, 21 seconds still, 21 back. The math of devotion. Beyond the rope line, the world pressed closer. Veterans with caps in their hands, children tucked under arms, tourists who had planned for monuments and instead found a living one. Bones rose and fell like a tide. Each time Ethan passed, the murmurs softened. He felt the pull even as he kept his eyes forward, felt the weight of eyes he could not meet, felt the ache beneath white gloves. He did not let it reach his stride. When his shift ended, the barracks returned to what they had always been for him, a small room, a chair, a hanger, a desk. Gloves in a straight line, laces coiled flat and true. Colonel Nathaniel Monroe waited by the door, cap under arm, jaw set, a folder thick with tabs in his hand. Sergeant Monroe said, voice hush low, chapel low. The Department of Justice has opened a formal inquiry. Subpoenas are out. Willow Ridge will answer. Monroe's thumb tapped the folder's spine. Paper rasped. Tabs like colored scars. Ethan slid his gloves together, thumb to thumb. Yes, sir. The governor wants you on record, Monroe added. So does the committee at the Capitol. They'll want dates times precise steps. They'll want your silence explained. Ethan met his eyes. Silence doesn't ask for permission, sir. But I'll speak. Monroe nodded once, approval and warning in the motion. Good. Keep it clean. Keep it yours. He left. The door eased shut. The room exhaled. A knock returned almost immediately. Claire Donovan slipped in. Hair wind-tossed, notebook open, pen poised, recorder in her pocket not yet turned on. Off the record, she said softly. Her voice had a rasp too many stand-ups in cold air, too little sleep. She rolled the pen between her fingers and left a stripe of ink on her knuckle without noticing. Ethan gestured to the chair. She sat. The desk creaked. How are you? She asked. He considered the question. I'm functional. That's not an answer, Claire said, a small smile folding one corner of her mouth. But I'll take it. He looked at his wrists, rotated them once. I've carried weight before, he said. But when it comes from hands sworn to protect you, it sits somewhere else, deeper. Claire's pen scratched, paused, scratched again. Do you hate them? No. He said it quickly as if the word were hot. Hatred is a luxury for men not on watch. She let that hang. People keep calling you a hero. He glanced past her shoulder toward the thin window where a sliver of marble could be seen if you leaned just right. Heroes are buried here, he said. I stand because they can't. Silence stretched thin and gentle between them, the kind of silence that doesn't demand to be filled. Morning brought wind and bright blue. More buses, more microphones. Signs on poster board, the governor's staff. Veterans clustered near the rope line, hands curled over Kane's chests lifting to attention. A portable podium that looked too flimsy for the weight it would carry. Monroe met Ethan at the walkway. You're sure, he asked. I'll keep it short, Ethan said. And true, Monroe added. They stepped out. 1,000 breaths became one. Flags stilled. Claire took her place to the side press badge showing recorder on. Ethan reached the microphones and let the air settle. He didn't grip the lectern. He rested 2 fingers on its edge as if to measure its distance to ground. I did not stand silent, he said, because I was empty. I stood silent because I am full of names I do not know, full of vows I did make, full of a watch I did not invent but was given. A ripple. Cameras leaned in. At Arlington, we honor what is missing, he continued. We honor the story that ends with a question. We honor the families who never received the knock they deserved or received it in a language no soul understands. My job is to translate that absence into presence. He lifted his hands an inch from the lectern. White gloves, thin scars beneath. Last night I was not asked a question. I was given an answer about what some people see when they look first at clothing, at skin, at posture, at a story they've already decided to write. No booing, no cheering, just listening. "I am not here to demand punishment," Ethan said. "I am not here to trade humiliation for humiliation. I am here to remind us of something simpler. Respect is not a medal to be pinned and removed. It is not a switch to be flipped when convenient. It is the baseline. It is the floor. It is the ground we are supposed to stand on before anything else begins." A woman near the front nodded, tears cutting clean lines down her cheeks. "If we cannot respect the living," he asked, "how can we claim to honor the dead there?" The line landed like weather. He stepped back. 1 pace. 2. He did not wait for applause, but it came tentative, then rising, rolling like a wave past the rope line and into the road. Claire kept her eyes on him, even as her hands worked recorder. Steady pen, sprinting, throat tight. Monroe took the lectern. "You've heard the sergeant," he said. "Accountability will follow." Reporters began to shout questions. Ethan did not return. He turned toward the stone. He needed the stone. He needed the math again. The honest count. 21 forward, pause. 21 back, pause. Later, after the buses thinned and the shadows lengthened, Claire found him on a bench under a maple the color of old fire. "On the record," she said. "Now." He smiled the smallest movement. "Now." "What should I call this?" she asked, tapping her notebook. "When I write it." "Not me," he said. "Not my name. Write the work. Write the watch." She waited. He considered. "Call it," he said slowly, "The Silence We Owe." She wrote it once, then circled it. Across town, Willow Ridge failed at quiet. Protesters hammered signs outside Mercer's shop. The sheriff's windows were papered with explanations no one read. Doyle and Briggs peered through blinds that could not soften a chant. Old complaints resurfaced like wreckage at low tide. Body cam footage rewatched, reports unboxed. A pattern emerged. In the evening news hour, Claire's story went live under his headline. She watched it spread, then put her phone face down and breathed. Ethan never checked. He ran a cloth over leather until it shone and thought of a mother waiting for a gift he had not yet bought. A small thing. A necklace, perhaps. Something without spectacle. Monroe knocked once. "Tomorrow the committee," he said. "Answer what you must," Monroe said. "Guard the rest." "I'll be there," Ethan answered. "You always are," Monroe replied, and left the way commanders do when they know saying more would say less. Night brought rain, soft at first, then steady. Ethan took his place again. Boot, marble, breath. He let the water touch his face and did not blink it away. On the other side of the rope, a boy in a too-big jacket counted under his breath. At 21, he whispered triumphant, "Pause," and his father squeezed his shoulder. The watch went on. The cameras dimmed. The file boxes filled. The nation for a moment listened harder than it spoke. And the soldier who would not bow returned to the work that asked for nothing and gave everything one measured step at a time. Morning broke over Arlington with a pale gray sky, the kind that promised rain but held back teasing. The air was cool, sharp, filled with the scent of damp grass and stone. The crowd outside the ropes was already gathering thicker now than days before. Veterans stood with flags folded under their arms, families clutched photos of loved ones lost, and reporters buzzed like flies, their cameras ready for another soundbite. Inside the barracks, Ethan Kane laced his shoes with slow precision. Each pull of the laces was deliberate, every knot sharp, his mind tuned to ritual. It was not vanity, it was armor. The world outside waited to devour him with questions and praise he never asked for, but his uniform creased spotless steady was his truth. Colonel Nathaniel Monroe entered with the force of a storm contained in flesh. A folder thick with documents weighed under his arm, the edges frayed from too many late-night briefings. His eyes burned with fire, but it was the steady kind, the kind that did not flicker, did not fade. Sergeant Kane Monroe said, dropping the folder onto the desk. It landed with a heavy thud. The Department of Justice has filed formal subpoenas. Doyle, Briggs, Mercer, even Sheriff Dalton, they're being pulled into federal review. Ethan adjusted his gloves, smoothing the fabric across his fingers until no crease remained. His voice came quiet, steady. Good. It means they will have to face what they chose. Monroe studied him carefully. Understand this, Sergeant. They will fight. They will twist. They will try to make you the issue. They'll claim you provoked them, that your silence was resistance. Ethan's eyes finally rose to meet Monroe's. Calm. Unblinking. Let them. The truth doesn't need to argue. It stood in front of them while they mocked it. It stood cuffed while they ignored it. The world saw. A silence stretched between them. Claire Donovan stepped in through the doorway, notebook open, recorder tucked in her jacket. She had barely slept. Ink stains smudged her fingers. Her eyes were alight with exhaustion and urgency both. "Ethan?" she asked softly. "Can I ask something off the record?" He nodded once. She leaned forward, her pen hovering but not moving. "When you stood there in cuffs, what kept you calm? Most men would have broken. What held you?" For the first time, Ethan's gaze drifted to the window. Beyond it, the marble stones stretched endless white markers cutting the field. He let the silence sit. Then he spoke, voice low. "The tomb, the watch, every step I've ever taken here, every silence I've ever carried for the unknown. That silence was stronger than steel. That's what held me." Claire's hand trembled as she scribbled the words. Later, Monroe led them both outside. The governor's convoy had arrived. A podium had been set, microphones waiting, flags rippling in the morning breeze. The crowd pressed forward, their voices swelling. When Ethan stepped out, the noise died. Veterans saluted. Children hushed. Phones lifted. Monroe spoke first. "This incident is no longer a matter for Willow Ridge alone. It is federal. It is national. But before the nation, we must listen to the man at the heart of it." He gestured. "Sergeant Kane." Ethan stepped to the podium. He didn't grip it. He simply stood, shoulders squared, posture unbroken. His silence filled the space until every murmur faded. Then he spoke. "I was cuffed. I was mocked. I was dismissed. But I did not resist. I did not fight. I did not argue, because silence was the only weapon left to me." The words rolled across the crowd, quiet but cutting. At Arlington, silence is not emptiness. It is honor. It is weight. It is what we owe to the men whose names we will never know. That silence was with me in Willow Ridge. That silence is with me now. The audience leaned in, breathless. You cannot cuff dignity. You cannot silence respect. And you cannot strip honor from a man who guards the fallen. The applause came like thunder. It rose, swelling until it drowned out the hum of cameras. Veterans saluted. Families wept. Claire's recorder caught it all. Her throat tight, her pen moving furiously. Ethan stepped back, his face unreadable, his posture still. He had not spoken for cheers. He had spoken because silence sometimes needed a voice. Monroe's hand touched his shoulder as he turned. "Well done, Sergeant. You reminded them of what they forgot." And that evening, as rain finally fell, Ethan returned to his post. Boots struck marble. Gloves tightened around steel. The rhythm resumed 21 steps, 21 seconds. The world might roar. Willow Ridge might collapse. But here in silence, Ethan Kane remained unbroken. The storm that began in Willow Ridge now swept across the nation. By the next morning, silence itself had become a movement. In Chicago, veterans stood shoulder to shoulder on Michigan Avenue, each of them marching 21 steps before pausing 21 seconds. In Dallas, families filled the steps of City Hall, holding candles in the drizzle, whispering prayers. In Los Angeles, hundreds stood barefoot in the rain, heads bowed silent for 21 minutes straight. Across every feed, across every screen, the name Ethan Kane had become more than a man, it had become a symbol. But inside Arlington, Ethan himself refused the noise. He laced his shoes slowly, gloves folded neat at his side. The barracks smelled faintly of polish and damp wool. He tied each lace twice, pulling until the leather hugged tight. Each movement was precise. Ritual mattered more now than ever. Claire Donovan slipped into the room, rain glistening in her hair, her recorder clutched but not yet turned on. She looked at him, really looked, and spoke softly. "They're calling it the Sentinel movement. Do you realize that thousands of people copying your silence? They're doing it for you." Ethan's hand stilled over his gloves. His voice was quiet. "Not for me. They're doing it for themselves, for the ones they lost, for the dignity they've been denied." Claire's pen hesitated above her notebook. She searched his face, seeing the distance in his eyes. But they see you. You've become the mirror, the proof that silence isn't weakness. Ethan said nothing more. He stood pulling on his gloves, his jaw set. A knock came at the door. Colonel Nathaniel Monroe entered crisp and sharp despite the long night, his cap tucked under his arm, his eyes blazing. Sergeant Monroe said, "Congress has summoned you, the Judiciary Committee. They want to hear your testimony." Ethan blinked once. "Me, sir," Hugh Monroe confirmed. "They've seen the videos. They've heard the governor. They want to hear from you directly. This won't be like a press conference. It will be sworn, on record." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then I'll give them the truth." Monroe's gaze softened, and that truth will weigh more than any oath. Hours later, Ethan walked the long hallway of the Capitol marble, echoing beneath his shoes. Cameras followed, flashes igniting like lightning. Claire kept pace at the edge, whispering into her mic. "Staff Sergeant Ethan Kane enters Congress today." His silence shook a town. Now his words may shake the nation. Inside the chamber, lawmakers sat in a half-circle, eyes sharp, pens ready. Cameras lined the back wall. Ethan raised his right hand, swore his oath, and sat at the table. His dress blues were immaculate, his posture unbending. The first question came from a congressman leaning forward, voice sharp. Sergeant Kane described exactly what happened in Willow Ridge. Ethan's voice was calm, measured. "I presented my federal identification. It was dismissed. I requested verification through Colonel Monroe. That request was mocked. I was cuffed without cause, though I complied fully. The evidence is on record." A senator pressed. "Why didn't you resist? Why didn't you speak louder? Why didn't you fight?" Ethan's eyes lifted, locking on the questioner. His answer was steady. "Because resistance would have proved them right. They wanted defiance. They expected anger. Instead, I gave them silence, the same silence I carry at the tomb of the unknown soldier. Silence is not surrender. It is discipline. It is strength." The chamber hushed. Pens scratched furiously. Cameras leaned closer. Another voice asked, "And what do you want from this apologies compensation?" "Justice." Ethan shook his head. "I want respect to stop being conditional. I want silence to be understood, not mistaken for weakness. I want those who guard the fallen to be guarded themselves." A murmur rippled through the room. When the session ended, Ethan rose, saluted, and walked out with Monroe at his side. Reporters swarmed, shouting questions, but he gave them nothing more. Silence was his shield. That night back at Arlington, he returned to his post. Boots struck marble. Gloves gripped steel. The rhythm resumed. 21 steps. Pause. 21 seconds. Pause. And as the nation watched, Ethan Kane's silence spoke louder than any law ever could. The morning after Congress felt different, sharper at the edges, louder, in the middle hollow at the center where decisions get made and lives get altered. News crawls kept Ethan Kane's name in the corner of every screen. The clips ran again and again, the oath, the sentence about silence and strength, the way he never raised his voice. But Willow Ridge woke to something else. Black sedans. Badges. A quiet that meant paperwork had become consequence. The federal team arrived at the sheriff's office just after 8. No sirens. No talking. Boxes waited on dollies. Evidence bags clicked open like sterile mouths. Sheriff Dalton stood on the steps with a statement clutched in his hand, 3 pages that said nothing. He read the first paragraph. He did not finish the second. Inside file drawers slid computers, shut-down cords detached. A clock on the wall ticked too loud for a room that had stopped pretending. Doyle watched from a hallway chair, hands folded, knuckles white. A door opened. An agent nodded. He stood. He walked in. Briggs followed 10 minutes later, his breath visible even indoors, like the air around him had turned to winter. Claire Donovan, press badge tucked into her coat, kept to the lobby pen, moving eyes everywhere. She spoke to no one. She wrote down everything. Deputy Doyle, an agent, asked, voice flat, when Staff Sergeant Kane presented federal identification. "What steps did you take to verify authenticity?" Doyle stared at a stain on the table. "We evaluated the situation." The steps the agent repeated. Doyle's jaw flexed. "We did not verify. Why not silence had a weight. It settled on Doyle's shoulders and made him smaller. Training, he said, finally not meeting anyone's eyes. We were trained to read behavior. The agent didn't nod. Describe the behavior you read. Doyle swallowed. He was calm. Too calm. Across the hall, Briggs ran a hand through his hair until it stood like grass after lightning. He wasn't in uniform, he blurted. He had that look, like he wanted to be seen. Which look, the second agent asked, pen still. Briggs flailed for something that would sound professional and found nothing. The strut. You saw a strut, the agent asked. Briggs deflated. I saw what I wanted to see, he whispered. The recorder light didn't blink. It wasn't that kind of room. But if admission had a sound, it would have been that. Outside the square had drawn new lines. Protesters at one end, flags, photos, steady chants. Across from them, a smaller group locals angry at being called a bad town, at being reduced to one night, one door, one pair of cuffs. Words crashed in the middle and fell to the brick in pieces. A woman stepped forward from the larger group. Mid-30s, a folded triangle of a flag pressed to her chest like armor. She didn't lift a sign. She didn't lift her voice until she had everyone's eyes. My husband, she said, is buried 3 miles from here. If the man who guards him says silence is strength, then that's my strength today. I am asking for exactly what he asked for, respect. No one answered her, not at first. On the other side, an older man in a farm cap lifted his chin. We're not monsters, he said, voice rough. We're tired of being called that. She nodded once. Then don't act like monsters when you're tired. The conversation ended there not because it was complete, but because it had hit something true and didn't know where to go next. Claire caught it all. Not on video, not this time. In ink. In the way her hand cramped when she tried to write faster than feeling. She left the square and walked 2 blocks to a plywood door with a bell that no longer rang. Frank Mercer's shop looked smaller, boarded up like a mouth closed against a confession. She knocked anyway. Footsteps, then silence, then the door inched open on a chain. Mercer's eyes were red. No smirk, no swagger, just a man who had seen his name become a headline and didn't like how it felt in anyone else's mouth. Mr. Mercer, Claire said, voice even, I'm writing about how a town remembers itself. Can I ask you what you see when you look at last night? He stared at her recorder off and then at her pen. I see a man who thought he was better than me, because she asked. He fought with a word and lost. Because he didn't flinch, he said. Because he stood like I couldn't move him. Because I recognized that look and I hated it. What look? The one that doesn't ask your permission to be exactly what it is, he said, and shut the door. Across the county line, Ethan dressed for another shift. Gloves laid like a promise. Shoes like mirrors. Cap straight enough to slice the morning. Colonel Monroe stepped in without knocking, a habit born where doors meant safety for seconds, not courtesy for minutes. Request for remark from the White House, he said, reading glasses, perched papers fanned like cards. Not a speech yet. A presence. They want you standing there when they say what they're going to say. Ethan's hands paused over his gloves. Sir, I know, Monroe said, closing the distance, lowering his voice. You didn't ask for it. You don't want the lights. But listen to me, sometimes the watch is on marble. Sometimes it's on a stage. The duty doesn't change, just the floor. Ethan nodded once. If I go, he said, I go as a guard, not a prop. You go as yourself, Monroe said, and that will be enough. They walked the path together, past the quarters, past the tree that dropped leaves like small quiet fires, past the line where tourists become witnesses. At the rope, Claire waited. Off the record, she said, breathless from a run, You may be going to the White House. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. She could read it in the set of Monroe's shoulders. On the record, she added, recorder raised, What do you say to people who feel split by this, who want to honor you, but don't want to condemn a town? Ethan looked past her to the stone that did not waver. 2 things can be true, he said. A place can be more than its worst night, and a night can be bad enough to demand change anyway. She wrote it exactly as he said it. Sometimes the line doesn't need polishing. It cuts fine on its own. The crowd today was different, larger, quieter. They had brought their children, their parents, their grief. Some came with anger. Most came with something gentler and harder to carry: shame for having looked away too often, pride for not looking away now. Ethan took his post. Boot, marble, breath. 21 forward. Pause. The world leaned in. 21 back. Pause. The world learned how to breathe again. Midway through the first hour, rain began a fine mist that beaded on his cap and skinned the marble in glass. People lifted hoods, but did not leave. A boy whispered numbers into the sleeve of his father's jacket and beamed each time he landed on the pause with Ethan's stillness. On the far side of the rope, the old veteran appeared, the same cane, the same hand that had shaken in the street, and held a salute anyway. He did not call out. He raised his hand just high enough for Ethan to see as he pivoted. The salute was smaller today. It was also perfect. When Ethan's relief stepped into place, the change happened with the precision it always had. Steel on shoulder. Heel to two. A razor of ceremony slicing the weather clean. Behind the line, Monroe waited. DOJ just announced preliminary findings, he said quietly as they walked. Negligence, bias, failure to follow verification protocol. If the recommendations hold, there will be charges. Ethan exhaled through his nose. No smile, no answer. Just an easing like a knot, remembering it can unmake itself. Also, Monroe added, congressional staff sent a thank you. Don't frame it. Ethan almost smiled at that. Almost. He returned to the quarters. The room felt smaller today, as if the walls had inched closer to listen. On the desk lay a small box, brown paper, no return address. He almost ignored it. He had avoided gifts, letters, anything with the weight of someone else's expectations. But the handwriting was careful, the kind that takes time. Inside a delicate necklace, a single gold bar, plain, unmarked, light enough to forget when worn, heavy enough to remember when held. A note folded tight. For your mother. From a stranger who stood behind the rope and learned what silence means. A daughter. Ethan pressed his thumb against the edge of the card. The simplest acts were the ones that undid you. He wrapped the box again, slower than necessary. He wrote an address from memory. He sealed it. Claire knocked softly. You've heard, she asked. He nodded. I wrote the square, she said. Not the shouts, the quiet parts. The widow, the farmer. She hesitated. And Mercer. Ethan didn't ask what Mercer had said. Maybe because he already knew enough. Maybe because mercy sometimes means letting someone else keep the last word they can live with. Monroe appeared in the doorway, one more envelope in hand. Briefing at 1600, he said. White House, likely tomorrow. Likely, Claire asked, half reporter, half friend. Likely, Monroe repeated. In my experience, likely is how certainty learns manners. They laughed, a brief human sound that didn't echo off stone, and that was a mercy too. Evening slid in. The crowds thinned but did not vanish. The rain held in the corners of the sky and thought about falling again. Ethan took the post once more. In Willow Ridge, the federal team rolled carts to waiting vans. Evidence rode away under gray blankets like bodies carried with ceremony. Sheriff Dalton stood on the steps again, same statement, different eyes. He folded the pages and put them back in his pocket without reading. Doyle sat in his truck a long time before turning the key. Briggs didn't get that far. He walked home and kept walking around the block, then again, as if the town might look new if he just circled it enough times. Frank Mercer flipped his sign to closed on a door that didn't open anymore, sat on a stool that didn't belong to him in any way that mattered, and stared at a counter that had once held a federal ID he could have read. Claire filed her story. 2 things can be true. She didn't add an exclamation point. She trusted the words to stand upright on their own. And in the dark wash of the evening, under a sky that couldn't decide, Ethan Kane measured the ground the way he always had. 21 steps. Pause. 21 seconds. Pause. Not for television, not for headlines, not for courtrooms that would fill and empty and fill again. For the unknown. For the living who had to learn again what honor sounds like when it doesn't need a microphone. The watch held. The storm did not. It learned the shape of a boundary and backed up an inch. Sometimes that is how change begins, with an inch. With a pause that refuses to be mistaken. with a guard who does not move when pushed and does not push when he could, and teaches a town, then a state, then a nation, how to stand. Rain came hard through the night. By morning, the steps of Arlington glistened slick marble, shining under a sky the color of iron. The storm had not chased the crowds away. They came still wrapped in ponchos, clutching umbrellas, their shoes soaked through, but they came. Veterans leaned heavier on their canes, children balanced on parents' shoulders. Families stood shoulder to shoulder, refusing to leave the place where silence had become sacred. Ethan Kane walked as he always did. Boots steady, rifle poised, eyes forward, 21 steps, pause, 21 seconds, pause. The storm-lashed wind tugged, but his cadence never broke. And beyond the rope, the drenched crowd mirrored him, their silence deeper than the thunder above. When his shift ended, Ethan stepped back into the barracks, peeling wet gloves from his hands. Water dripped from his cap. His uniform clung to him like a second skin. He set his rifle down with care, each movement precise. Colonel Nathaniel Monroe waited with a towel in hand, though his own uniform was soaked from standing in the open air. His expression was hard but not unkind. "The storm doesn't move you, Sergeant. I've seen men break under less." Ethan dried his face, his voice calm. Storms pass. The watch remains. Claire Donovan entered a moment later, notebook pressed to her chest, her hair plastered with rain. She had stood in the storm too, refusing to retreat with the others. "The live stream hasn't stopped," she said breathlessly. "Millions are watching Ethan. They're calling it the Watch of Silence. Cities everywhere are copying you. They march 21 steps in the rain. They pause 21 seconds in the cold. You've given them something to hold on to." Ethan looked at her, water dripping down his temples. "I didn't give it. It was always there. I just carried it long enough for them to see." Claire's throat tightened. She scribbled the words down even as her vision blurred. By mid-morning, news anchors announced that the White House had formally requested Ethan Kane's presence. A symbol of discipline and dignity, the statement read. A reminder of the values we claim but too often forget. The convoy left Arlington at noon, rain still falling. Black SUVs cut through the slick streets, tires hissing over pavement. Inside the lead vehicle, Ethan sat in silence, cap on his knees, gloves folded, rifle secured at his side. Claire sat across from him, pen racing, her recorder humming. "You're about to stand in front of the president," she said quietly. "Does that feel different from the rope line?" From Willow Ridge, Ethan's eyes lifted to hers. His answer was simple. The fallen don't care about podiums. They care that the watch is kept. Claire swallowed her pen, faltering. She realized again why his words landed like stone. They came not from pride, but from vow. At the gates of the White House, the convoy stopped. Cameras flashed like lightning. Reporters shouted questions, their voices crashing over each other. "Sergeant Kane, do you believe America has failed its soldiers?" "Sergeant." "What would you say to the deputies now, Sergeant? Are you a symbol of protest?" Ethan walked past them without answer. His silence said enough. Inside the East Room, rows of seats filled with lawmakers, veterans, families, and press. The chandeliers blazed overhead. The podium stood waiting, flanked by flags. The president entered to applause, then raised a hand for quiet. Last week, the president began, "A man was cuffed, not for what he did, but for what someone assumed he was. He did not fight. He did not shout. He stood silent. And in that silence, he reminded us what respect means." Then turning, the president gestured, "Staff Sergeant Ethan Kane." The room erupted. Cameras flashed. Veterans rose to their feet in salute. Ethan stepped forward. His steps were measured, each one echoing in the chamber like a drumbeat. He stood at the podium, eyes sweeping the crowd. He let the silence stretch until the flashes slowed, until the whispers faded. Then he spoke. "I was cuffed. I was mocked. I was dismissed. But I did not resist, because resistance would have proved them right. Instead, I carried the silence I learned at the tomb, a silence that belongs not to me, but to every soldier who gave everything." He paused, the weight of his words sinking into the chamber. "You cannot cuff dignity. You cannot silence respect, and you cannot strip honor from a man who guards the fallen." The applause shook the room. Some wept, some saluted, some simply bowed their heads. Ethan stepped back, his face calm, his posture unyielding. He had not spoken for cheers. He had spoken because silence needed to be translated for a world that had forgotten how to listen. And as the cameras beamed his image across the nation, the storm outside raged louder. But inside for a moment there was only silence. The silence of respect, the silence of honor. The silence Ethan Kane had carried all along. The White House address rippled outward like thunder rolling across plains. Television networks looped the footage of Ethan Kane standing at the podium, his words steady, his silence heavier still. Newspapers filled their front pages with his face not in uniform, not saluting, but standing with the calm of someone who needed nothing to prove who he was. By nightfall, cities across America gathered again. In Boston, they stood on the harbor in rows counting 21 steps along the water's edge. In Houston, veterans lined the streets outside the VA hospital, pausing every 21 seconds as cars honked in support. In Los Angeles, candles lit the sky along Griffith Park, each flame held by hands that trembled with memory. They called it the Vigil of Silence. At Arlington, Ethan returned to the tomb. The rain had passed, leaving the air clean, the grass shining under moonlight. Crowds lingered still beyond the ropes, quieter now reverent. Parents held children who had fallen asleep against their shoulders, unwilling to leave until they had seen the sentinel walk again. Ethan stepped into rhythm. Boots struck marble. 21 steps. Pause. 21 seconds. Pause. He carried the weight as he always had, but tonight the weight felt different, heavier, yet shared. Claire Donovan stood at the edge of the crowd, notebook pressed against her chest. She didn't write. She didn't record. She simply watched. For once, she let silence speak for itself. When the shift ended, Ethan walked into the barracks. His gloves came off with care, fingers lingering over the creases. His rifle rested on the rack. Colonel Nathaniel Monroe entered moments later, his cap tucked under his arm, his face unreadable. Sergeant Monroe said the DOJ has finished its review. Recommendations are out. Charges will be filed. Ethan didn't ask which charges. He didn't need to. His jaw tightened, his eyes steady. So it begins. Monroe's voice sharpened. It began the moment they put steel on your wrists. This is the consequence. Claire entered behind him, her notebook ready. The sheriff. The deputies. Mercer Monroe nodded once. All named. False arrest. Abuse of authority. Civil rights violations. Mercer faces obstruction and instigation. This won't end quietly. Ethan sat on the bench, staring at the faint scars on his wrists. His voice was calm. Nothing ends quietly, but maybe it can end with truth. The next morning, Willow Ridge braced for its reckoning. Protesters filled the square louder than before. Reporters swarmed every sidewalk. Veterans arrived in buses filling the steps with flags and folded hands. The courthouse doors opened to federal agents leading Doyle and Briggs inside, their faces pale, their hands cuffed this time. The chant rose like thunder. Respect the guard. Respect the guard. Sheriff Dalton stood before microphones, sweat dripping down his temples. His voice cracked as he stumbled through words of regret, but the crowd drowned him out. His career was finished. The town knew it. He knew it. Inside Mercer's boarded shop, the windows rattled with the chants outside. He sat on a stool in the dark, muttering to himself, his reputation already gone. He thought of Ethan's calm eyes, the way he hadn't shouted, hadn't cursed. That silence had cut deeper than any words Mercer could throw. Back at Arlington, Ethan prepared for another shift. His gloves tightened, his shoes gleamed, his cap cast shadow across his eyes. Claire sat nearby, watching him with quiet intensity. "They're calling you a hero," she whispered. Ethan shook his head. "Heroes are buried here. I'm just the one who walks so they're not forgotten." Claire's pen trembled as she wrote the words. When he stepped onto the marble once more, the crowd hushed. He began his watch. Boots striking in rhythm. Silence deeper than applause. And far away in a small Virginia town, steel closed around the wrists of men who had mocked what they never understood. The rhythm had turned. Justice was beginning to march. The courthouse of Willow Ridge groaned under a weight it had never carried before. Reporters filled every inch of the steps, their microphones lifted like bayonets. Protesters pressed against barricades, their chants rolling like waves. Veterans in faded uniforms stood, solemn flags clutched in their hands. Inside, the air was thick with heat and sweat. and the low murmur of history being written. Deputy Doyle sat at the defense table, his jaw clenched, his hands folded too tightly in front of him. Beside him, Briggs shifted in his chair, sweat shining along his hairline, his eyes darting everywhere but forward. Sheriff Dalton hunched in the corner, a shell of the man who once strutted down Main Street with easy authority. Frank Mercer had been summoned too, his suit ill-fitting, his smirk long gone. He looked smaller than the man who had once mocked Ethan Kane across a counter of plastic flags. Federal prosecutors laid folders thick with evidence onto the table. Subpoenas, body cam footage, reports long buried, now resurrected. The weight of proof settled like stones. Outside, Claire Donovan narrated for the nation. We are live from Willow Ridge. Deputies Doyle and Briggs face charges of false arrest and civil rights violations. Sheriff Dalton is accused of negligence and failure to enforce proper conduct. Frank Mercer faces obstruction. And at the center of it all, the silence of Staff Sergeant Ethan Kane has become impossible to ignore. The crowd roared at her words, then hushed when the courtroom doors opened again. Ethan Kane entered. He wore his dress blues gloves, white shoes gleaming under the courthouse lights. The faint scars on his wrists were visible only if you looked closely, but every camera caught them. He moved with the same precision he carried at Arlington, measured, calm, unyielding. The courtroom stood. Veterans saluted. Families clutched each other. Even the judge's gavel could not quiet the reverence that followed Ethan into the room. When called to the stand, Ethan raised his right hand, swore the oath, and sat. His voice was calm, deliberate, each word cutting through the silence. I presented my federal identification. It was dismissed. I requested verification through my commanding officer, Colonel Monroe. That request was mocked. I was cuffed without cause, though I complied fully. I did not resist because resistance would have proved them right. I gave them silence, the same silence I carry for the unknown soldiers I guard. Gasps moved through the gallery. Doyle shifted in his chair, face pale. Briggs wiped sweat from his temple, his smirk gone. Mercer lowered his eyes to the floor. The prosecutor leaned forward. Sergeant Kane, why does silence matter to you? Ethan's eyes lifted steady. Because silence belongs to the fallen. At Arlington, we march 21 steps, pause 21 seconds, repeat without end. That silence is respect. It is discipline. It is honor. And when I was cuffed in Willow Ridge, I carried that silence still. They mistook it for weakness, but it was strength. The gallery erupted cheers, sobs, applause, until the judge's gavel thundered again. Outside, the crowd swelled, chanting louder than before. Respect the guard. Respect the guard. Claire's voice shook as she reported live. Sergeant Ethan Kane has testified. His silence has become the loudest voice in this courtroom, in this town, and across the nation. That night, as the courthouse emptied and the crowd slowly dispersed, Ethan returned to Arlington. The moon hung low, casting silver light across marble. He stepped onto the platform, rifle at his side, gloves tight. Boots struck the ground. 21 steps. Pause. 21 seconds. Pause. Beyond the ropes, the crowd had not left. They stood in silence, mirroring his rhythm. Families, veterans, children, all breathing together, all waiting. And in that shared silence, Ethan Kane felt it, the shift. His silence was no longer his alone. It belonged to them now. To a nation that had remembered at last what respect sounded like when words failed. The verdict came on a gray morning. Clouds hung low over Willow Ridge, pressing the town into silence heavier than any storm. Reporters filled the courthouse lawn, their voices muted as though even they understood that history sometimes demanded quiet. Veterans lined the steps, saluting in solemn stillness. Families clutched flags folded against their chests. Protesters held signs, their chants softer, now more like prayers. Inside the packed courtroom, the judge's gavel cracked once. This court has reviewed the evidence, the testimony, and the record. Deputies Doyle and Briggs are found guilty of false arrest and civil rights violations. Sheriff Dalton is found guilty of negligence in office. Frank Mercer is found guilty of obstruction and instigation. Gasps rippled across the room. Doyle's shoulders sagged, his jaw trembling. Briggs dropped his head into his hands. Dalton closed his eyes, the weight of failure dragging his posture low. Mercer stared ahead, hollow, as though his smirk had been buried for good. The judge's voice carried clear and steady. Sentencing will follow, but today this court affirms that honor, respect, and dignity are not optional. They are owed. The gallery erupted cheers, sobs, applause that shook the wooden benches. Outside, the chant swelled again, this time like a hymn. Respect the guard. Respect the guard. Through the roar, Ethan Kane sat quietly in his seat. His dress blues were immaculate, his gloves folded on his lap. He did not smile. He did not cheer. He simply lowered his head for a moment, honoring the silence that had carried him here. Colonel Nathaniel Monroe placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "It's done, Sergeant." The reckoning came. Ethan's voice was steady. "Respect was the goal, sir. Justice was the cost." Claire Donovan's recorder shook in her hands as she whispered her final words for the broadcast. The man who stood silent in Willow Ridge has become a voice for millions, and today silence has prevailed. That evening, Ethan returned to Arlington. The sky cleared at last, stars scattered sharp across the velvet dark. The air smelled of wet grass and stone, fresh after the storm. He stepped onto the marble. Boots struck with perfect cadence. 21 steps. Pause. 21 seconds. Pause. The rifle gleamed under moonlight, the rhythm unbroken. Beyond the rope, the crowd had not left. They stood shoulder to shoulder, families, veterans, strangers. Some saluted. Some bowed their heads. Some simply watched with eyes wet and steady. Among them, the old veteran raised his cane, his trembling hand forming one last salute. Ethan turned crisp and exact, returning it. The man's eyes shone as he whispered, "For all of us." Ethan's voice was low, carried by the night. For them. The silence deepened. The world seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, nothing moved but Ethan Kane's boots on marble, and in that stillness respect was no longer an idea. It was alive. Across the nation, people stood in living rooms, on street corners, in fields, and in city squares. They walked 21 steps. They paused 21 seconds. They mirrored the silence of a tomb guard who refused to bow. Ethan Kane marched on, not for himself, not for fame, but for the unknown, for the fallen, for the dignity that could never be cuffed. And under the stars above Arlington, the watch continued, eternal, unbroken. If you like the story, consider sending a super chat to help bring more similar stories. Now click on the video on the screen to hear another story that is equally powerful and compelling, with courage, sacrifice, and a choice that makes you question everything you know about duty and justice. Click on the video.